Good morning, everybody. We are privileged to welcome today renowned author and teacher, Mr. Philip Goldberg. Mr. Goldberg has been studying India's spiritual traditions for more than 50 years as a practitioner, teacher, and author. He is the author or co-author of more than 20 books, including Roadsigns on the Spiritual Path and the award-winning American Veda, from Emerson and the Beatles to yoga and meditation, How Indian Spirituality Changed the West, which was named one of the top 10 religion books of the year by both Huffington Post and American Library Association's Booklist, and received the award for special distinction by the Uberoi Foundation for Religious Studies. His latest book, The Life of Yogananda, the story of the yogi who became the first modern guru, is the first full-scale biography of Paramahansa Yogananda. An interfaith minister and meditation teacher, Mr. Goldberg is an illuminating and entertaining public speaker who has presented at venues throughout the US and India. He blogs on Elephant Journal and Spirituality and Health magazine, conducts tours of India with American Veda tours, and co-hosts the popular Spirit Matters podcast, which features interviews with spiritual teachers and leaders. He will speak today to us on how Vivekananda changed America. And at the end of the lecture, he will also be at the back of the hall signing books on American Veda. Welcome to the Vedanta Society, Mr. Goldberg.
Thank you, Diane, for the kind introduction. It's lovely to hear that in a British accent. I'm always honored to be, when I get an opportunity to participate in any way in this illustrious lineage. I hold the Ramakrishna Vivekananda lineage in very high regard and always have, and then especially when researching American Veda came to fully appreciate its impact on the US, and that's what I wanted to speak about, having the opportunity to be here. Because I'm convinced that the transmission of India's deep and precious spiritual heritage to the US over the course of the last 200 years or so, which I researched for my book, is one of the most important developments in American history, probably all of Western history, and certainly among the most, if not the most important development in the religious and spiritual history of the West. The impact that subtle but profound infiltration, you could say, of the core teachings of Vedanta and yoga philosophy and the methods that are associated with it have had on our culture are deep and profound. And the evidence of it just keeps growing. American Veda came out 9 years ago, and I could make a even stronger case for that now. And it's reflected in data, that I won't bore you with. But I have come to think of America as a nation of yogis. You could say yogis and Vedantists. And when I say that, people don't quite understand. They think I'm referring to all the yoga studios. And I have to point out that no, I mean yoga in the deepest sense of the word. And if you look at surveys of how people approach religion and spirituality, especially in the last few decades, you come to see that the population more increasingly reflects the core values and teachings that you associate with modern Vedanta and deep yoga philosophy. There are yogis in church pews and synagogues and secular meditation centers and yoga studios and doing mindfulness walking in Central Park because they acknowledge the unity of all that is, and they acknowledge their core identity as Brahman, even if they don't know that word. They may never have heard the word Vedanta. They may not know who Vivekananda is. And if you say, oh, but you're a yogi, you understand the unity of things. You seek to realize that oneness in your spiritual life. That makes you a yogi. And they'll say, but I can't even touch my knees, let alone bend in yoga positions. But they're yogis in the deepest sense of the word. And the core teaching of this lineage that truth is one and the wise call it by many names, or variously, however it's expressed, that has become to be a core understanding of a tremendous percentage of Americans if you ask the questions of how they see the world. They don't, the exclusivist mentality that of sort of old-fashioned religion, of course, is still with us. And, but increasingly, people recognize that there are many paths to divine realization and that paths are individual, that everybody should be free and is free to carve out their own spiritual path, and that there are things to learn from all the traditions. This is how especially young people are pursuing their own spirituality as increasingly spiritual independence, or what has been called the unaffiliated, or the spiritual but not religious, or the nuns with an N-O-N-E-S. And they're yogis. And in their beliefs, they are Vedantists, just as Ralph Waldo Emerson and Thoreau and Walt Whitman were, even though they'd never met a Swami, they'd never met a yoga teacher. There were no yoga studios in Concord, Massachusetts at that time. But they were yogis in the deepest sense of the word. And that is the way American spirituality is evolving, or has evolved, and continues to. And the connection, the access to India's essential spiritual heritage is responsible for that to a large extent. And so, because in many respects, Swami Vivekananda got the ball rolling for that, his impact should be more widely appreciated. And so I'm happy to have this opportunity to do that. There's many, many people, many factors responsible for what I just described, and many individuals who contributed to it. And I had to profile all those people, and I had the privilege of looking into all their lives. And in that sort of constellation of luminaries who brought these teachings here and articulated them in a way that allowed them to assimilate and enter into the fabric of the American mind and heart, in that constellation, of course, Swami Vivekananda is kind of a light of lights. And since it's been 125 years since he came here, and because the people of India like to count the full next year as part of the anniversary. This is still the 125th anniversary celebration, even though it's really the 126th. So I want to explain a few of the ways that Vivekananda, his influence is still with us. And the first, is it possible to get some water? Ah, thank you. The first, of course, is that he was the first. And that counts. That means something. I mentioned Emerson and Thoreau and all those people. They were among the first to be exposed to the literature of Vedanta and of Indian philosophy in general. But then it had to be embodied at some point. And that's what Swami Vivekananda did in 1893. You all know that story. But when he came to Chicago in 1893, it was a very big deal. And you have to, you could fully appreciate it if you look at what America was like in 1893. Most Americans, especially in the Midwest where he made his impact in Chicago, they had never even met a Jew. And Catholics were being discriminated against in major cities. It was only less than 30 years after the Civil War. So a dark-skinned man would have been treated quite differently from what occurs today. And a dark-skinned man in strange clothing representing what people would have thought of as a heathen religion. It took courage to deal with that. And it's for those reasons I always call Vivekananda the Jackie Robinson of American Veda. And if you don't understand why I refer to Jackie Robinson, please Google it. It would break my heart if you didn't know Jackie Robinson's story. But to break through that, and what a lot of people don't know, I'm going to reveal something to you, many of you know this, but the Parliament of World Religions became famous because of Vivekananda and is commemorated to this day by the Parliament. It's presented, we think of it as this wonderful ecumenical event where, they wanted to bring all the representatives from all the world's traditions together in this way. But there was a hidden agenda. America was a dominantly Protestant country at that time. Even, papists and, Catholics were discriminated against and degraded. And the organizers of the Parliament were predominantly Christian ministers, Protestant ministers. Some of them had the right intentions. Some of them, and there's documentation for this, they saw the Parliament as they would bring all these people together from these inferior traditions, and by the end of the conference, it would be obvious that their Protestant tradition represented the culmination of spiritual evolution and was superior. They were not prepared for Vivekananda to steal the show. He was just another of the heathens being represented. And so when he rose up and drew admiring, in some cases adoring audiences, and had to be scheduled more frequently and had to have, repeat his talks, it was a very big deal. And the publicity that resulted and his speaking tour that came out of it, it marked a moment in history where Americans were exposed to something new and different and radical in the way of understanding our relationship to the divine. And some of the people, you saw in the circumstances surrounding that, two kinds of Americans. There were the people who rose up in opposition to Vivekananda and denounced him and, may have been even threatening. And then there were the others, the open-minded Americans who were not threatened by foreigners and who embraced diversity and were pragmatic and open-minded enough to say, oh, well, that sounds good, and he has something to offer, and isn't he brilliant? Why don't we come back and see him again? And let's learn from him. He has something to offer. There were always these two kinds of Americans, and lo and behold, there still is, as you all know from everyday news. But it was the open-minded, curious seekers that embraced Vivekananda and got the ball rolling for the infusion of Vedantic ideas into American life. And that has, with all the backlash and opposition that has occurred over the course of the next 120 years, prevailed. The second thing I wanted to point out is that Vivekananda had the foresight to recognize that Americans could benefit from these teachings, and that in order to perpetuate his work, he had to have an organization, and organizations should have buildings. This is a bigger deal than you might realize, because I just wrote a full-on biography of Yogananda, who I'll come back to. He too had to create organizations, and he didn't like it. Renunciates aren't necessarily, they're not exactly like the people who go to Harvard Business School to run corporations. But organizations are a necessity, and he had the foresight to do that. There were other swamis and yogis who came to America in the early part of the 20th century, and we don't remember any of them because they didn't stay very long and they didn't leave behind what Vivekananda left behind by way of an institutional structure and literature. And that legacy was terribly important. And of course, the connection to Bellarmut in India, where the swamis who came here were trained and prepared to come. All that is a terribly important thing. There was those other swamis did not have that foresight or the motivation to do it. And the literature that Vivekananda left behind, just even if the 4 slim volumes of the 4 yogas was all that left behind, that was a tremendous contribution. Those 4 books were read, still being read, as many of you know, but in the times that I'm most familiar with, because I lived it, the upheaval in the 1960s, and well, it began even earlier, but especially in the late 1960s and 70s, where interest in everything India and Indian philosophy and Indian methodologies of spiritual practice were ascendant in the baby boomer counterculture. We read those books. George Harrison, how many know George Harrison? You know, when the Beatles took up transcendental meditation in the late 60s and then went to India, it was a watershed moment in the history of East meeting West. And I write about the impact of that on the... Well, one of the reasons that happened was because George Harrison read Raja Yoga. It was one of two books that he talked about the rest of his life of having turned him around in his spiritual seeking from having discarded the Catholicism he grew up with to when he discovered the sitar as a musician and went to study with Ravi Shankar in India. He was given books to read. He was starting to look into Indian philosophy. And Raj Yoga was one of the books that he talked about for the rest of his life, having changed the way he understood everything. The other was Autobiography of a Yogi. So all those factors, the books, the buildings, the legacy, the system of training swamis, the opening of centers around the country, all that was a terribly important thing. And over the course of decades, in the early part of the 20th century, the Vedanta societies, except for the occasional yogi or swami who would come and teach for a while, they were really the place where anybody interested in Indian philosophy would find a home. They may have been informed by the New Thought movement, which in turn had been informed by Emerson and all the books that were coming in from India. But they could find a home in the Vedanta centers. And some of what then occurred gradually over the course of the 20th century was that these things spread not just because of great personalities and figures like Vivekananda, but when people are touched by these teachings and their lives change because of the teachings, they tell other people. All of you probably had. And maybe you reach family members, maybe you reach friends. But some people are profoundly impacted by these teachings or discover something of great value. And some of those people become famous, like George Harrison. And some of those people absorb these teachings, study them, incorporate them into their own fields of expertise, and express them in ways that transmit the teachings out into the world to other people. Sometimes in explicit ways. Hey, I discovered Vedanta, I discovered yoga philosophy, this is what you should know. In other ways, more subtle, by just incorporating into their own fields of expertise, whether it's art or music or literature or philosophy or scholarship or whatever. And in the mid-20th century, as many of you know, some of the people who were students of the swamis at Vedanta societies had an enormous impact on the world. So in New York, in the 1950s, for example, just across the park, where Swami Nikhilananda was teaching, Joseph Campbell, how many know who Joseph Campbell was? No one knew Joseph Campbell when he was studying with Swami Nikhilananda. He was a young scholar whose life's work was still ahead of him. And that life's work, which reached millions and millions of people and still does, was deeply informed by his interaction with Swami Nikhilananda. He worked with him on the translation of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, and went to India with him. And all of Joseph Campbell's body of work, if you look at it, is informed, sometimes very explicitly, sometimes implicitly, by the core teachings of Vedanta. Similarly, at the same time, J.D. Salinger, the novelist, was studying with Yogananda. How many of you have read Salinger? Keep your hand up if you read anything after Catcher in the Rye. Those later books are filled with the teachings he was absorbing from Yogananda, and it turns out he was very conscious of using his artistry to depict, in his case, young New Yorkers trying to attain deep spiritual development in the midst of life in New York and struggling with that. And he knew it was his way of communicating the core teachings of Vedanta to Western readers. If you go back and read a short story like Teddy or the Franny and Zooey, when I was young and seeking and living in the East Village in the 60s, I read those books, and they had a huge impact on me. It made me think I was not crazy. I was having these thoughts and reading these things and thinking life is different than what's being presented to me, and there were Salinger's books to help me out. And in St. Louis in those years, with studying with Swami Sarvapriyananda, was a young scholar of religion named Houston Smith. How many know who Houston Smith was? We just had his 100th birthday. Oh, he passed a few years ago. Most of you know that Houston Smith was very famous because he wrote the foreword to American Veda, right? But he was actually famous before that. I was very honored that he did that, but he was the foremost scholar of world religions in the second part of the 20th century, and his textbooks were read by millions of people. And if you read his classic textbook and every other book that came after it, or watch his famous series that he did on PBS with Bill Moyers, you see the importance of Vedanta philosophy on forming how he understood religion. The way he describes all the world's religion is in a very Vedantic framework. And when I interviewed him, when I was researching American Veda, he was already very old, and he was frail, and he was slumped over in his chair. And I said, the first question I want to ask is, I want to explore how much of an impact Vedanta had on your life. And he rose up in his chair and straightened up and said, it was immense. And that his influence therefore spread. And of course in Los Angeles, at the same time, Swami Prabhavananda was mentoring Christopher Isherwood and Aldous Huxley and Gerald Hurd and all of that. And they started the Vedanta Press, which produced a flood of books that informed all the seekers of that era in a very, very profound way. That collections, and I remember reading Vedanta for Modern Man, I think it was called, and Vedanta for the West, these anthologies of, and I still have some of those books. I did not bring them with me as proof, but I still have on my bookshelf some of those books from the Vedanta Press that I devoured in the mid and late 60s. And I was living here. I moved 100 times, and they're still with me. And they're torn, they're yellowed, but they cost 95 cents. And I still have the How to Know God interpretation of the Yoga Sutras and the Crest Jewel of Discrimination. All those thin paperbacks are still in my, they had a huge, I remember going down to Weiser's Books to get them. Weiser's doesn't exist anymore. It was an esoteric bookstore. It's the only place I could find those books. And I'm just using myself as an example, but that's part of the Vivekananda legacy. And it was of huge importance in the 60s and 70s when gurus and swamis started coming here in larger numbers. And that's what the other thing I want to get at that is not appreciated as much as it should be. Because a lot of the Indian spiritual teachers who became very famous in that era are better known because it was, of course, much more recent. And they were here in the age of jet travel and mass communication. Vivekananda didn't have the benefit of those amenities in the few years he was here, and some of them were here in the West for many, many years. So, but they all owe a debt to the foundation that Vivekananda created, not just because the audience for the teachers that came in the 60s and 70s especially was sort of prepared by Vivekananda's legacy, by the books, by the Vedanta societies, by the important people that I just mentioned. And the whole New Thought movement, which was very important. So they not only established help establish the readiness and the openness to embrace these teachings, but it's a very important consideration that in many ways Vivekananda set the template for how subsequent gurus and swamis presented these teachings to Americans. The way he was able to communicate in the 1890s to an America that was vastly less informed than people would later be, and the way he was able to articulate the core teachings so that people understood they were compatible with reason and scientific evidence and the known facts of history. In modern English, this was terribly, terribly important. Not only were the teachings non-threatening, but they could be, they were not seen as antithetical to the modern mind, unlike the religious teachings they were used to. The way he was able to make it understood that America's love for individuality and the supremacy of individual choice and freedom of expression and freedom of belief was compatible with what India had to offer, and in fact, essential to that. This was exactly what all the other gurus would subsequently do, but they had a template for it, and they all grew up in India, where Vivekananda was a national hero and a figure of great renown, and so they would have understood that, and they all did exactly that. The way these teachings have been framed and expressed would have been different in the 60s and 70s from the 1890s, and different in the 1920s and 1930s, because times change. But the essential motivation, the essential task of expressing it in rational ways so that there was nothing superstitious about it, there was nothing antiquated about it, there was nothing that forced people to make a choice between scientific evidence and the spirit of empiricism. They didn't have to choose between dogma and their own inner experience. They were not being asked to believe in anything. They were not saying your salvation depends on you conforming to this belief system or this set of dogmas. They were given the opportunity to sample these teachings, try it out in their own minds, try it out, the methodologies in their own experience. And when people took to meditation in the 60s and to Hatha Yoga and all that, it was in that spirit. And that's what prevailed. And it's a very modern, not just modern, but deeply American way of evaluating anything. Does it work? Does it suit me? Does it hold up to evidence? And the template for that was set as early as 1893 with Vivekananda. So all the teachings who came, all the other teachers who came, they were doing the same thing. They were adapting, and this is critical. And this is another thing that Vivekananda sort of was a role model for. They all had to adapt these teachings to the modern mind and to the audience they were addressing. Yogananda had to do it in the 20s. Maharishi Mahesh Yogi and Swami, all the Swamis, Muktananda and the others in the 60s and 70s, they had to be sensitive to the frame of mind of the people of that era. So they had to adapt the language, the delivery system. But they had to do it because of who they were and their understanding that some things can be adapted, but some things must be protected. And so they had to find ways to communicate effectively, to show the tremendous diversity and flexibility of these teachings, but also do so in a way that maintained the integrity of the teachings and their link to their sources, the ancient sources, so that the teachings did not get distorted or diluted or corrupted in the process of adapting them. And if you look at Vivekananda's work, you see that's how he did it. And I'm sure if you were a young renunciate in India and you started to have thoughts of I'm going to communicate to other people, or if your guru said you're going to teach, or you're going to go to the West, Vivekananda would have been presented to you as a role model. In studying the teachers who came in the 60s and 70s, and I was in the presence of some of them. I spent a lot of time with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi when he was most famous after the Beatles. That's what they were doing. They were adapting these teachings, making them compatible with science, but holding on deeply to the integrity of the teachings. Among those many teachers who came later, I want to single out Yogananda because I just wrote a biography of him last year, and because he's probably the most famous of the teachers who came here because of his autobiography of Yogi. And he came in 1920, so he was between Vivekananda and all the teachers of the 60s. And when he came, in studying his life, it's very clear the Ramakrishna Vivekananda influence on him. He spent his formative years from age 13 until he became a Swami and then came to America in Calcutta. How many of you have been to Calcutta? And upriver to Bellarmut and Dakshineswar. Okay, so I've taken tours there. And we go to Yogananda's family home, and we go to his ashram, which is just down the river from the Kali temple, and right next to the Sarda Mutt, where the women monastics are trained in your lineage. And the proximity to the Ramakrishna Vivekananda lineage is extraordinary. And in researching his life, he, from age 13 on, this is the early part of Vivekananda came to America the year Yogananda was born, and passed when Yogananda was 9 years old. So when he moved to Calcutta, the Ramakrishna Vivekananda lineage was fresh and deep and powerful at that time. He would have known all about it. He would have been part of that. And he went to Scottish Church College, where Vivekananda would have been the illustrious alumnus. So, by the way, did Srila Prabhupada, who brought the Hare Krishna movement to America. He also was a child of Calcutta and a graduate of Scottish Church College. Would have been a little boy when Vivekananda was teaching in America. And that influence was palpable in those years. When Yogananda was an adolescent, he would have heard about all this. He was a distant relative of Sri Aurobindo, and as many as you know, Aurobindo was deeply affected by Vivekananda. He knew he met Tagore. Tagore would have been deeply familiar with and admiring or reverent toward Vivekananda. Yogananda's best friend's father was a classmate of Vivekananda at Scottish Church College and had pictures of them together in the house. And most important, when Yogananda was a young seeker, he was studying with whatever guru and Swami he could, and he had several important mentors in his teen years before he met his own guru and became a disciple and then a Swami. And one of probably the most important mentor was a guy he called Master Mahasya. Do you know who that was? That was M, who you know as the compiler or the author of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. In those years, he was an educator, and you could walk from Yogananda's home, which one can still visit as I bring groups there. And that home, by the way, is about a 15-minute stroll to Vivekananda's home, where Vivekananda was born and raised and is now a national museum. And if you haven't been there, you should go. So that neighborhood in Calcutta was profound in its impact. It was a big part of the early days of the Indian independence movement. It was an intellectual and political sort of cauldron, and spiritual. There were yogis and gurus and little ashrams all over the place. And Master Mahasya, used to take young teenage, well, he wasn't yet Yogananda, to Dakshineswar, and they would sit and have the darshan of Ramakrishna, and Yogananda would go and meditate for long hours where Ramakrishna had sat. So that impact was deeply embedded in Yogananda when he came here in 1920. And where did he come first? To Boston for 4 years. We're only 20 or 25 years after Vivekananda was there and lectured at Harvard, where then Yogananda would come. So the impact on him was profound. And then he had this huge impact on America, and he in turn influenced all the gurus of the 60s and 70s. So for all these reasons, Vivekananda's impact is still being felt. And I feel like people like me, I never became a devotee of this path, but I owe tremendous amount to this lineage and to Vivekananda's work and example, and I'm extremely grateful for it. And everybody, regardless of which path they follow, which lineage they're associated with, who their guru was, they owe something to Vivekananda. And it's important, I think, to honor that. Because with all the yoga that's now available and all the way these teachings have spread, and if we don't have a sense of connection to what I sometimes speak to young yoga teachers in training, and they think lineage means their teacher. But there's a Maha lineage. and Vivekananda's role in that should be honored and valued, because it helps to keep the teachings intact in their integrity and not corrupted. And when I look at current events and I reflect on Vivekananda's first speech in 1893, he warned against religious fanaticism. Listen to that speech, or listen, you can't listen to it, you can only listen to the actor who people think was Vivekananda. But read it, and he said maybe this Parliament, 1893, would be the death knell of fanaticism that has been so hard. Well, it wasn't, as we know from recent evidence. But the message is as relevant now and more urgent than ever, given current events. So I would leave you with, by urging that you remind everybody you know of that message and the core teachings of Vedanta, core teachings of yoga. We're becoming a nation of yogis, but it can't happen fast enough. And the message of unity and the message of non-fanaticism and of inclusivity and of oneness that is represented here in this building by these great teachers, we need it more than ever, and we all have a role to play in that. So thank you for listening. Oh, and I want to say, next week, my friend Jeffrey Long is speaking here, and you should all come and listen to Jeffrey. And for any of you who were disappointed that Swamiji was not the speaker this morning, you can hear him on my podcast. We interviewed Swamiji. We also just interviewed Jeffrey Long about his new book on reincarnation. That's the latest. So go to spiritmatterstalk.com and hear some of your favorite spiritual teachers. Thank you for coming. Thank you for welcoming me here.